Ladies and gentlemen, we have another exclusive episode of The Citizen Digital on Mwananchi. Welcome once again. Today we'll be having a conversation with the new US Ambassador to Tanzania, Michael Bato. Michael Bato, karibu sana.
Asante sana.
Well, it's a very pleasure to meet you today. I'm sure our audience, our readers would want to know more about your time here in Tanzania, what you plan to do. Okay. But first and foremost, let's get to the basics. Can you just give us a brief, who is Michael Bato, to anyone who wants to know you?
Well, you know, I have had a long career. I've been an academic administrator, retired military officer, a diplomat, a member of the clergy. But all of my life has been spent in public service and dedication to the principle that people are the world's best resource. And if we respond well to people, we build a better world. That's in a nutshell who Michael Bato is.
Interesting. And then again, you have served in the African continent. Now you're in Tanzania, but it's not your first time in the public service within Africa. Can you give us a bit of some of the highlights when you served at the African Union as the ambassador and also the Economic Commission for Africa? What have been the highlights? What are the success stories?
Well, the biggest highlight was that we were able to craft for the first time a document which constituted an agreement between the United States government and the African Union. Previously, the U.S. and the African Union had functioned in an ad hoc fashion where things were not written in principle. We were able to come up with a memorandum of understanding on cooperation, which allowed the U.S. government to be able to invest tremendously in the African Union. Give you a good example. The African CDC was founded during the time that I was at the AU, when we started the initial meetings introducing the Atlanta-based CDC to African medical facilities, and growing out of that, we have now a profoundly functional and exceptional Centers for Disease Control here on the African continent. We also crafted ways that we were able to certify laboratories that are used in medical research. We started that process by having documents that allowed us to work together and which gave the perimeters and definitions for our relationship. Exciting also was meeting people like President Kwete. I met a number of times the African Union. Presidents from the east of Africa, the west of Africa, north of Africa, and south of Africa. I was able to travel to 24 different African nations because my role was multilateral diplomacy as opposed to bilateral diplomacy.
Indeed. But then again, we understand that over a couple of years, the U.S. has kind of lost ground in terms of its influence on the African continent. So we're seeing other superpowers such as China and India gaining ground. Then again, at the U.S.-Africa Summit last year, Biden met with a couple of leaders from the continent, including President Samia. Can you tell us how the foreign policy has evolved, specifically on how the U.S. cooperates or partners with the African continent?
Now, I want to go back to your premise. The premise is that the U.S. has lost ground. The U.S. has not lost ground on the African continent. When you look at the fact that we remain the largest contributor to development on the African continent, we remain the largest development entity on the African continent in terms of aid. What has happened is that we've understood that there's a necessity for a philosophical shift in our relationship with the African continent, where trade and investment is more paramount than simply giving money. Because, you know, back when Obama was in office and President Biden is continuing the same trend, there was the notion that Africa must be a strategic partner with the U.S. And if you're a strategic partner, then you have to get away from this notion of giver and dependent. You have to have people coming together at the table as partners, working together collaboratively and intentionally. And that's the focus that the U.S. has taken. Now, when some people look at us and say, well, you moved back in the sense of not building infrastructure. But when you look at Tanzania, for example, the road from Dar es Salaam to Zambia was built by the U.S. We've done thousands of kilometers of road on the African continent. We've expanded the electrical grid in multiple places on the African continent. What we do not do, however, is we do not stand up and brag a lot. I wish we did brag more, because we should tell the story.
Exactly.
We have spent more money on the African continent in healthcare than any other single nation on planet Earth. In the last 20 years alone, in Tanzania, $7.5 billion in terms of our aid for healthcare and education and other kind of programs. That doesn't even consider the amount of money that we spend and invest in terms of security, not only for military, but also for assisting Tanzania's police force and drug enforcement agencies and other agencies. We do it because we believe that we are a friend to the African continent, and nobody, no nation, or no group of nations will ever exceed America's commitment to the African continent.
I mean, indeed, and I saw recently President Kikwete, former president, was invited to the U.S. where they were celebrating the 20 years commemoration of PEPFAR. So the success within the health system is also commendable. Now, let's talk about Tanzania specifically. We understand that you have a strategy, indeed, but as you begin your tenure as the envoy to the U.S., what do you bank your strategy on? What are your key focus areas?
You know, this is the best time in the world to work in Tanzania. I'll give you two reasons. One is because President Samia has an absolute commitment to the goals of investment and trade, an absolute commitment to the well-being of the people of Tanzania in terms of health care, which is very consistent with what I bring to the table. A desire to partner with her, to partner with the government of Tanzania, and to partner with the people of Tanzania to expand trade opportunities. I'll give you a reason. No government, not the US government, the Tanzanian government, the China government, no government can by itself hire all of the well-educated people in its nation. There are not enough government jobs to give everybody a guaranteed wage based upon their affiliation with government occupation. So we have to create the space for private enterprise. We have to create the space for investment, create the space where agriculture in a place like Tanzania can be so expansive that it ends poverty by guaranteeing that every Tanzanian will have enough food to be healthy, and at the same time creates the opportunity for Tanzania to take advantage of the ports that it has. No other place in East Africa has the capacity to be a trade hub for the whole region, for the Indian Ocean, and for transnational trade and investment. Tanzania is blessed with great ports. It has the land base that is fertile for growing crops and agriculture. And most of all, it has the people resource. Tanzanian people have learned the secret of how to live in peace with each other, where you don't have these big divides about what religion you are, what tribe you are, what ethnicity you are. Tanzanians have embraced the dream of Julius Nyerere, one people, one nation, united and free. This is the opportunity to work with Tanzania, and that's what makes me happy about being here.
Okay, so now when we talk about the potential that Tanzania has in terms of economic growth, you've talked about it being, a trade hub in the region and potentially even Africa.
Absolutely.
But it's almost in the abstract. Oftentimes over years we've been hearing about Tanzania's potential. You talk to this leader, they say the same thing. When does it become practical? When do we now implement it? Now, you as the US, a big economic partner, what do you think has been the hurdle over the years? What impedes Tanzania from realizing its true economic potential?
Yeah, John Ping, who used to be the chair of the African Union, used to often say that what Africa needs, and in this case what Tanzania can appreciate, is that its potential and its capacity must be in harmony. So we have to try to work with Tanzania to lift the capacity to the point of its potential. There is no question about political will. Tanzania has the political will to become a major thrust in international business. We have to help Tanzania build that capacity. So we've offered, for example, an opportunity for Tanzania through Deloitte, with no expense on Tanzania's part, to be able to have an opportunity to review contract negotiations that are made with other nations so that Tanzania comes out on the winning end. We have to find a way, not only with the US, but with international partners, to see if we can help Tanzania modernize its agricultural productivity. It's one thing to have the land and to have the seed, but you have to have the equipment to be able to farm efficiently and effectively, and also the capacity to store products once they are taken from the earth. For example, in many instances, Tanzania, Kenya, and other places in East Africa have lost millions and millions of dollars worth of food because there was no storage capacity to maintain the food to get it ready to be shipped. We have to help Tanzania build the capacity, and I am committed to the U.S. being engaged with Tanzania in capacity building because the political will is there, the insight and wisdom of its leadership is there. We just have to help with capacity building. And once that happens, the time is now. The day is now. The opportunity is now for capacity to meet with dream.
Perfect. So that means that working with the private sector is quite critical in this strategy.
Yes.
So I just want to get a sense of how your leadership here plans to enhance relations with the private sector, because we understand, I believe it was last year, a group of investors, companies from the US, came on to explore some of the opportunities in mainland and also in Zanzibar. And then again, we also seen the Europeans, over 600 investors came for the European Tanzania Business Summit. Now, what is the strategy specifically on how you're going to work with the Tanzanian private sector and also encourage more American companies to invest in the country?
The strategy is in learning from Tanzanian businesses what it is that they feel that we could give best as an added value. Trying to encourage Tanzanian investors. You know, there are a lot of wealthy Tanzanians who invest money in different parts of the world. And we want to encourage wealthy Tanzanians to partner with us in investing money in Tanzania. And in fact, one of the main thrusts of the first Africa Leaders Summit, which I worked to help plan because I was senior advisor to the State Department at the time, and our thrust was if we could find wealthy Africans interested in reaching agreements with wealthy Americans about how to build structure for business growth and opportunity, that's the best solution. Government to government, people to people, industry to industry. That's where we're headed here in Tanzania.
Okay, maybe I just want to get your opinion. When it comes to Tanzanians in the diaspora investing in the country, we're seeing that remittances, if we're to do a comparison between what Kenya is getting, what Rwanda, Uganda are getting, Tanzania is lagging behind, specifically because we don't have the dual citizenship. Now, we have willing Tanzanians who want to invest, but then they see the laws, the regulatory system as being, quite very strenuous, very limiting. What is your opinion on that?
Well, one of the goals of Africa 2063 and Africa 30, where there's going to be an evaluation, is for the development of common markets to exist in the EAC, in SADC, and throughout the rest of the continent. One of the things that Tanzania is discovering is that in order to be the leader in the EAC that it wants to be, its trade regulations will have to be modernized. It would have to be more in sync with the capacity of a person coming to Kenya and doing business in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda simultaneously, Burundi and Rwanda simultaneously. And for Tanzania to reach that point, Tanzanian leadership will wrestle with how to get harmony in its trade regulations with the rest of East Africa. One of the reasons that you have the EAC being more active now is that they're working on trade regulations, what is called harmonization of trade laws. And once the laws are harmonized, American businesses, for example, would rather be able to do business in Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda simultaneously. without having one set of regulations in Kenya, another set of regulations in Uganda, and a third set of regulations in Tanzania. So I think the EAC is going to force the harmonization of trade laws and regulations. If we're going to get to 2063, harmonization has to happen in the regs first.
Okay, perfect. So when we talk about intra-trade, within the EAC, and then now we're seeing the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, I just want to understand if the US has sort of looked at how you play a part in enhancing trade within the EAC member states, but also now using the continental big opportunity to enhance your trade. Because we understand that recently I was talking to one of the big investors. Okay. We are viewed as a continent that is willing to work with Western countries other than trading within amongst ourselves due to certain fears. Now, how does the US view the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and how prepared are you to play your part?
From President Bush to President Obama, there was an intentional focus on continental free trade on the African continent, where the agreements were looked at in terms of their multilateral advantage. I think President Biden is coming back to that notion that you cannot and should not have exclusive bilateral relationships with a continent that sees itself emerging into multilateral relationships. Now, if the African continent perceived itself as being a combination exclusive of 55 bilateral entities by itself, then bilateral to bilateral is the only way to go. But the African continent models its 2063 after the European Union, not after a United States of Africa. It sees the European Union as the model. So in the European Union, you have trade relations that go throughout the continent, where people can deal with one country and go throughout the continent, where you could travel and go throughout the continent without having to go through one visa regulation if you're an African citizen in the African continent. Africa wants to get to the point that you could travel in all 55 nations on the continent without having to go through all of these different regulations. That's where our focus is now, on understanding the advantage of multilateralism. Give you a good example. The United States was the first non-African nation to establish a diplomatic mission to the African Union, because it was the first non-African nation to recognize the benefit of multilateralism as it comes to a relationship with the African continent. We are fully on board. We would love to see every element of Africa 2063 materialize. It would be most advantageous to the way we see the rest of the world if Africa reached its 2063 goals.
Okay, now let's look at some of the external factors that are inhibiting the growth strategies for Tanzania and also Africa. We've been through COVID. There's still remnants of that, fears of COVID-19 in Tanzania, in Africa, and globally. But then again, the war in Ukraine and Russia, it has impacted trade. It has impacted a lot of spheres of the Tanzanian and African economy. But then there is also this talk about that all this is happening while the US is there. There's a role that you have to play as a global superpower, because the world looks at the US as an example. Absolutely. Now, I want to get your opinion on that, whether enough has been done to sort of help Africa, to help Tanzania combat, issues like COVID-19, and also the situation, security in Ukraine, in Russia, that is having that ripple effect on the African and Tanzanian economy. What do you say?
Well, let's start with the first one, COVID-19. And I have to start by congratulating President Samia. In a very short period of time, she opened the door, Tanzania, opened the door to allow for the U.S. to provide COVID testing and COVID vaccinations. Tanzania, in a very short period of time, went from having an extremely low rate of vaccination to an extremely high rate of vaccination. Tanzania leads as an example of what can happen to fight COVID-19. That's a success story on behalf of Tanzania, and we helped with that success story. We were your partner. We stood with Tanzania, we stood by Tanzania, and we will continue to be. Now, this war in Ukraine, I want to give a parallel. Nyerere always said that a nation has the right to control its own destiny, that its sovereignty rests in the hands of the people.
Yeah.
What Russia has done, motivated out of jealousy and envy, because Russia saw Ukraine having the largest nuclear power producing capacity in Europe. Ukraine was producing more wheat and more food than most of its neighbors. Ukraine was the breadbasket for the region. Ukraine was providing the rest of the world with wheat and grain. Ukraine set the example for what it was like to be a modern nuclear power generator. Russia saw that. Putin got jealous and envious and decided that it was his time to now bring Ukraine back to a former state where it was a part of the old Soviet Republic. Now, can you imagine if Germany or the UK or Arab partners looked at Tanzania and said, she's too successful. She's moving in the right direction. Her president is not only leading in Tanzania and East Africa, but leading in the African Union. Her president is moving across to the US and China and the rest of the world. Can you imagine what would happen if Germany decided, we want to take it back? If Britain decided, we want to make you a protectorate again? Or if any Arab nation decided, we want Zanzibar again? That's what Russia did in Ukraine. That's why the war in Ukraine is hideous, it is evil, and it is motivated by arrogance and excessive greed on the part of Putin. Putin started the war, he could end the war. And you know, people say, well, Americans are supplying Ukraine with weapons. Well, if you were standing in a schoolyard and somebody was beating the pulp out of you, I think you would enjoy somebody saying to you, at least I'm going to help you defend yourself. That's what the U.S. has done, is tried to help Ukraine defend itself, to maintain its sovereignty, to maintain its independence. And we will continue to do that.
Okay, so has the action that has been taken by the U.S., we're seeing the economic sanctions, but you're also supporting Ukraine with weapon supply. Are they being effective enough? Because the war is still ongoing. Is there any other possible way that this war can be put to an end?
Yeah, the war can be put to an end quite simply. All Putin has to say is that Ukraine has the right to its own sovereignty. Ukraine has the right to control its own destiny. Ukraine has the right to be the largest nuclear power producer in Europe. It has the right to produce wheat and grain for the rest of the world. If Putin sat in his rocking chair one day and said, you know what? I'm tired of being jealous and envious. I'm going to let this nation be free. The war would be over. There would be no weapons to supply for somebody trying to defend themselves, because there would be no overly aggressive superpower trying to force its will on a free and independent nation. So what the U.S. has done and what much of the world has done is said, we need to stop this as soon as we can. And more importantly, what Ukraine has done, Ukraine has proven that when you're fighting for your survival, a small group of people can fight against a large, massive army and can survive. Putin never thought this war would last a year. He never thought it would last more than 30 days. But he was shocked by the strength and tenacity of people who are fighting for freedom. Tanzania understands that better than anybody else in the world, because Nyerere's whole focus was that if we unite as a people around our own sovereignty, to control our own destiny, control our productivity, control our future, control our laws, and control the way we interact with other people, nobody would be able to put us down. That's what Ukraine is trying to do. Ukraine is trying to be a modern-day Julius Nyerere.
Okay, now we understand that the Ukraine and also many countries that support the Ukraine, mostly European countries, have been trying to rally support from Africa, Tanzania included. but we have maintained a very neutral position in this
Yes.
matter. In fact, in the recent UN resolution, Tanzania was not present. So I want you to talk about now the Tanzania's perception and how it has reacted to the war in Ukraine, even though it is a fact that it has affected us on an economic scale, but then also a Tanzanian has died at the war. Now, I want you to get a sense of how does Tanzania feature in this whole Russia-Ukraine war? Are we taking the right step, in your view?
Tanzania has a philosophical position, and its philosophical position is non-alignment. Its philosophical position is that it chooses not to take a side. We will continue to encourage Tanzania to see that in this particular instance, the sideline is less advantageous than standing up for sovereignty, freedom, and independence. And so we understand Tanzania's position. We understand why Tanzania has a sense of non-alignment. And we are trying in dialogue, as partners do. When you have differences of opinion, you try to persuade. You try to encourage. We will continue to say to Tanzania that the UN needs your vote, that we need your vote. And at the same time, we will understand Tanzania's desire to have its own integrity in terms of its non-aligned position. Our friendship with Tanzania will not cease based on a vote in the United Nations. And as a friend, simultaneously, we will continue to encourage Tanzania to see what would happen if one of the former powers that tried to control your destiny sought to return and exert its control over you. Tanzania would say, no, this cannot happen. And we would stand alongside Tanzania and say to the UK, to Germany, and anybody else, you cannot take Tanzania again. Tanzania is its own people. It has its own freedom. It has its own sovereignty. That's what Ukraine had, and that's what we want for Ukraine again.
Okay. As we're still on the topic of security, we understand in the recent couple of weeks, there have been security alerts that have been issued by the U.S. embassies in Dar es Salaam, in Nairobi, that have had quite an impact on tourism. We saw some international airlines that suspended flights to Zanzibar, flights to Dar es Salaam. Without diverging a lot of information because it's security, I just want to understand how the embassy cooperates with the Tanzanian government whenever such an issue arises, before and after.
Yeah. Before we issue any kind of statement, we try to verify and validate the degree of danger and the threat. And we do that not only with our own sources, but we do that in collaboration with the intelligence apparatus and the policing apparatus of Tanzania. And then we communicate with the Tanzanian government. I made a personal commitment to Foreign Minister Tax. I said to her that I will always inform her in an open and transparent manner and always collaborate with her and with the foreign ministry whenever any kind of alert emerges. Now, the reason we do alerts is that we want to protect the safety of people, not just American people, but the safety of Tanzania itself. Because if some kind of terrorist explosion were to go off in Tanzania, and if we had a suspicion that it was likely to happen, we want to make sure that Tanzania knows about it. Because if we could capture whoever it is who's intending to do that, we make Tanzania more peaceful and more quiet. And that's what we want, and that's what we will continue to want for Tanzania. But we will cooperate, we will collaborate as we have done in the past, and we will continue to do. From my vantage point, I will personally make it a point to coordinate and collaborate with the foreign ministry about these kinds of things.
Okay, so just as a matter of record, you mean that the embassy usually informs the government before issuing any security alert? Because we often see that the reaction from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is they often condemn such acts. They tell that the embassy to communicate with the government or at least have a proper communication channel.
You know, We have had and will continue to have proper communications channels, and we have used and will continue to use those proper communication channels. What we will do better, however, is that we will make sure that there is a direct communications from the highest level of American presence in Tanzania to the highest level of Tanzanian presence in Tanzania that has to do with foreign affairs. So the things we will do better is we will communicate very directly. The things we will continue to do is alert whenever we think that there's something that might happen that may cause damage to us and to anybody else here in Tanzania.
Okay, so as we come to a close, Mr. Ambassador, what is your vision for your leadership, for your time here as the envoy of the U.S. to Tanzania? And at the end of the day, what would you want to define your time here in Tanzania?
At the end of the day, I want my time in Tanzania defined by free and open trade and investment, by helping to strengthen Tanzania's own capacity to move toward greater democratic space. The government has already done some remarkable things, opening up for political dialogue, looking at the media laws and trying to reform and revise, opening up conversations between Tanzania and Tanzania's own internal oppositions, opening up communication between Tanzania and the rest of East Africa, opening up conversation between Tanzania and the African Union. Your president had a meeting with the Libyans at the African Union, which offered an opportunity for Libya and the African Union to resolve some of its differences. Your president met with Prime Minister Abiy, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, at the African Union. She met with a tremendous number of people, staging Tanzania as the place to be respected and to be regarded when it comes to global affairs. She came to the U.S., not just for the African Union Summit. She had meetings with Vice President Harris even before the African Union Summit. She didn't wait for an invitation for a summit before she came to the African Union or to the U.S. She went to other parts of the world, took the initiative to do so because she envisions Tanzania as the leader that Tanzania has the right to be. And at the end of my tenure here, I want to be able to say, Tanzania and the U.S., we've gone a long way. We've built some foundations, and we're going to keep on moving forward. As your president says, there is no reverse. It is only moving forward.
Well, on that note, Mr. Ambassador, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You were with me, Mpoki Thompson, for the Citizen Exclusive of Mwananchi Digital. Until next time, bye-bye.